is in the processing of written irony, and this is work that I'm doing together with my PhD student Henri Olkoniemi, whom some of you guys have already met. I'm sure you guys will meet him again. So I work at the University of Turku. I teach stats, and that's okay. I can live with that. University of Turku, even though it sounds like Turkey, it's nowhere close to Turkey. It's the country up in the north, and we've had a very good day today at the Olympics. We've won 1 gold medal in cross-country skiing, another silver medal in cross-country skiing, and we beat the Russians in ice hockey, which will lead to a very, very interesting game on Friday against Sweden. So I'm sorry guys, you won't see me during that time, because it's a great game. Okay. Going to irony. Imagine that you're reading a little story like this to our friends who have plans to have a weekend picnic together. Anne has asked one of her friends to stay at her place. She wakes up, looks out from the window, and it's raining heavily, and she says, "Oh, what a great day for a picnic." And what you see here is that Anne is actually being sarcastic, or actually ironic in this case. So the sentence, "what a great day for a picnic," even though the sort of the surface level meaning of it seems to be that it's a great day, what she actually means is that the day is not at all great for a picnic. And this is a very interesting phenomenon, I think, because what happens there is that there's a local coherence break. So there's this person called Walter Kinch who's got a whole theory about text comprehension, and he talks about how readers construct a 3-level representation, memory representation of the text while they are reading. So there's the surface level representation, which is actually preserving the actual words that the reader is going through. For example, "what a great day for a picnic." Then there's the text-based level representation, which is constructed of the propositions that are implied by the sentences there. For example, "day is great for a picnic." It's my poor attempt of trying to represent the propositional representation for that sentence. And the third level is the situation model. The situation model is something that the reader constructs by combining whatever text information there is with prior knowledge and prior experiences, and also when constructing a situation model, the reader is integrating sentences of the text together. So what happens when you encounter an ironic comment like "what a great day for a picnic," what happens is that there is a coherence break between the situation model level representation and the surface and the text-based level representation. So the reader is faced locally with the problem, which is true. Is it a great day? Is the situation described by the text a great day for a picnic, or is it a rainy day, a horrible day for a picnic? And that's how I got interested in irony and how readers comprehend irony. I think it's such an interesting thing where there's a local coherence break, and the question is, how do readers resolve this coherence break in the text? Now, I'm of course not the first person ever who's interested in this. There are several theories. And the old-fashioned, or one of the first theories, is called the standard pragmatic view. And according to this view, there's always like a 3-step process when readers are trying to resolve the irony. So first, readers go with the literal interpretation, with the surface level thing. They read it as if it is a great day for a picnic. Next, they notice that there's actually a discrepancy between what is being said in the text and then the context in which it appears. And that leads to the third phase, which is look for an alternative interpretation or a new meaning for the sentence. And that's how they end up with resolving what the speaker or the person described as a speaker text actually means. Now, the standard pragmatic view has been criticized a lot, and the later views have been trying to sort of more precisely describe what's happening when readers are resolving irony. So Rachel Biora came up with a theory called graded salience hypothesis. She thinks that readers go with whatever looking for the next interpretation. So that's the main difference. She thinks that all these interpretations are maintained simultaneously in the reader's mind. Well, then there's the direct access view proposed by Gibbs. He says, well, it's just another form of language. It does not necessarily take you any extra time to understand utterance as irony. It's resolved on the spot and often does not take you any more time to understand irony than it takes you to understand a literal sentence. And then more recently, P. Hexman has proposed parallel constraint satisfaction view, which is, as all views or theories that are of this type, pretty liberal in the sense that it's very difficult to make specific predictions based on it. But she's saying, well, readers see whatever cues there are available, and then they sort of, based on those cues, they come up with several different possible interpretations, and whichever interpretation is most active after the reader has gone through the text, that is what they think is the final interpretation of the utterance. Now, each and every one of these views, of course, have got empirical support. I think there are some crucial methodological problems. For example, Gibbs says, well, if you see a sentence as an ironic sentence, it does not necessarily take you longer time to read it than a literal sentence, but he has not actually been comparing same sentences to each other, but comparing different sentences, and then creates a little problem if you're trying to argue something based on reading times, if you have not controlled for anything within the sentences. But so this is what then Richard Giora has done, fighting against Gibbs, showing that if you take and compare the same sentences in literal and ironic context, then you do see a difference. And these results seem to support that actually comprehending irony does take you extra time. But the question is, I think, what is the exact time course of resolving irony? So we do suspect that it takes a little bit longer time to understand irony than it takes you to understand a literal sentence. What I think is interesting is to know exactly when does this extra time, or when do readers need this extra time. So there's only one eye movement study published, or actually now there are two because we got our paper published. But when we were doing the proof, and those guys had not yet published their thing. But what they found was that irony is processed relatively late. So if you look at the eye movement measures that are sensitive to irony are the late measures, like the regressive path to durations and total reading times, or total fixation times. So these kind of results, I think they suggest that when readers are resolving irony, they do engage in this sort of 1, 2, 3 sort of a process where they first go with one interpretation, they notice that it's not right, and then they look for another type of interpretation for the difference. However, there are some studies, for example, an ERP study reported by Katzedo, that show that it's actually possible that irony is resolved as soon as possible. So they found some effects really, really early on, which suggests that the reader constructs the meaning of the goal. Now, very easy, we do have the eye tracking system available that allows us to distinguish between these two different predictions. We can go ahead and see what happens when people are reading ironic sentences. Is it that it materializes relatively late during the course of processing, or do we see effects relatively early?
Good question. So how about, when I see irony, I'm thinking already about dominant and subordinate meaning of the same word, right?
Of the same word? Like
Yeah, where you would have like the normal, say, you would have, so ports being either the wine or the harbor. Here you have something similar where something could be interpreted either in a literal sense or a figural sense, and then the literal one would more often be the dominant one. Did somebody ever do that to the classic Fraser and Rayner experiments with irony, where you would push it towards one of the interpretations and see whether or not you get an early effect?
So not with eye tracking, no. But this is actually exactly the idea that Frederick Giora has, that some sentences you more often encounter as in the ironic meaning. For example, yeah, right.
Yeah.
Typically use it when you don't think that yeah, right. So she's saying that if you have ironies like that, those are faster to comprehend as ironies, and in that case, the ironic interpretation wins, and the literal interpretation loses the sort of fight for which interpretation would be correct.
So that would be more like a dominant interpretation based on frequency.
Yeah, your prior experience. But then again, a lot of times ironies are not something that you have encountered them before. A lot of times ironies are novel ironies, that a person says something just in that context, and that same sentence might not have been ever used as an irony before for you. So that kind of thing works on these sentences. Yeah.
Johanna, the study at the bottom of that page, the Katzital study, so it says that they got the effects during first pass reading. So what was the nature of that study? It's an ERP study. Was it concurrently recording the item?
No.
So
Just single word presentation, and they got the effect before, when they were presenting the sentence one word at a time, so they got the peak effect, I think before the reader had actually finished the sentence. That's that kind of thing. So first what we did was just to see what happens. So we did an experiment. We had 52 participants. There were 24 experimental texts. We constructed 2 versions for each text so that we could compare exactly the same sentences that were just presented in different contexts, either in literal context or in ironic context. Recorded eye movements back then, we did not have, I think, 1,000. This is quite an old study when we collected the data. And there were 2 questions asked. One, just to check whether the reader had actually read the text, like a text memory question. And then another question that was an inference question, tapping whether the reader had understood the meaning of the ironic comment or not. And here's an example of the text we've used. So there's a short pre-context. There's a critical context that's sort of making the next sentence either ironic or non-ironic. So if it was raining heavily and the street was flooding, when the target phrase is "what a great day for a picnic," this context here makes this sentence ironic. However, if this same sentence appears after the sun was shining and the weather was warm, suddenly this target phrase is literal. So each participant saw either version of the text, and these were the type of questions that were asked. We recorded or we computed phrase level eye movement measures instead of word level eye movement measures, and the reason for this was that I think that in this case the unit of analysis is the phrase, the ironic phrase, and not a single word in there. We could, in principle, of course, find the word where the sentence becomes irony and see what happens at that point. But in this case, we thought that this sort of phrase level measures give us good enough picture of what's happening while readers are reading the phrase. So we had first pass sentence reading times. We had 2 different measures. We had progressive fixation duration or progressive fixation time, which is the sum durations of the fixations that the reader makes on the sentence while progressing in the sentence. And then we have immediate or first pass rereading times, which is the sum duration of the fixation that the reader is doing while rereading the sentence before exiting it. So it's like immediate rereading of the same sentence. And then we have look back time, which is the sum duration of fixations returning to the sentence after reading it for the first time. So later look backs, how much do people go back in text and reread stuff. Now, these are the results from experiment 1 of this study 1. So we ran LMEs on this data. I'm sorry I don't have this descriptive means and stuff for you, but these are, you can, if you look at the estimates, you might be able to make sense of it. So we have responses to these questions that they were asked, you see that the ironic texts lead to slightly poorer comprehension. So the scale here is one, but what you get here is that even though readers do spend extra time reading these ironic target sentences, they don't always get the meaning of the target sentence. Now, originally in experiment 1, I started looking at the data and I thought there was a lot of individual variability. I did my best to try to sort of dig into it and find out about it and God knows what. And at this point, we already submitted the paper to various journals who all said that please go ahead and collect more data. We had 52 participants already. I thought it was pretty much, but wasn't enough. So we had to go ahead and run another study. So we ran experiment 2, and this is where Henry came along. So this is Henry's master's thesis data. So we collected data from 60 participants and tried to tap into what might be sort of causing this individual variability that we seem to be seeing in the data. And we had two sort of usual, let's say one usual suspect, which is the working memory capacity, and then one new candidate, which is need for cognition. And then Texman and colleagues have developed a measure that's supposedly measuring your tendency to use sarcasm in real life situations. So the reason why we thought working memory capacity might have something to do with irony comprehension is that, well, working memory capacity seems to have to do with practically everything. So it's a good usual suspect. Now, something that working memory capacity might be needed for when you're comprehending irony is that you might need that capacity in order to maintain multiple meanings simultaneously in mind. That's a similar kind of way as you might need working memory capacity when you're reading ambiguous sentences. Need for cognition is it's a questionnaire, and it's supposedly tapping into a cognitive style. So we were thinking that maybe we have participants who just, generally speaking, enjoy trying to resolve meaning of weird things. So it's a measure of more, not like basic cognitive constraint, but more measure of cognitive style, whether you enjoy engaging in cognitively demanding tasks. And then the self-reported use of sarcasm scale is just a simple questionnaire where you have to respond to various scenes or sceneries and say, well, what would you say in this situation?
Don't you run the risk that if you ask somebody, do you often use sarcasm, that the ultimate sarcastic answer is no?
Well, yeah, there's no such a question exactly. I also have to say that I tried to develop my own test of self-reported use of sarcasm. It got very good psychometric qualities, but it did not seem to measure use of sarcasm or comprehension of sarcasm, so we had to ditch it, but it was a good practice for me too.
Johanna, what's the difference between sarcasm and irony? Is it just the same thing? Is it like you just use the two terms interchangeably?
Yes, I do. I'm sorry about that.
Yeah.
The sarcasm is like a form of irony in a sense that sarcasm is always meant to hurt you or sting. So sarcasm stings. Irony could be just like you don't necessarily need to try to hurt or something like that. But sarcasm always is with the intention of you're trying to be mean. So we just added these individual differences measures. Otherwise, it was more or less like the experiment 1. We did tweak a little bit the text so that we would only have one type of sarcastic or ironic comments there. And the only measure that had anything to do with reading of these sarcastic versus literal sentences was working memory capacity. So this is the probability of initiating an immediate rereading. And here you see that here we have plotted for low, medium, and high working memory capacity readers. So you see that high working memory capacity is related to an irony So what we found from study one was that resolving the meaning of an ironic utterance does take extra time, so it is somewhat cognitively demanding. The effect is seen as increased immediate and delayed rereading, so we get the effect in immediate first pass rereadings, but also as an increased looking back in the text to the target sentence. And this seems, at least in my opinion, it suggests that readers are doing some sort of reanalysis of the utterance. They do need to go through this 1, 2, 3 step process in figuring out what it means. And this is something that the standard pragmatic view and the graded saliency view would predict. Parallel constraint satisfaction view would predict it as well, but the problem with it is that it would predict practically any any result. So there we go. And if you think about what's happening in text comprehension research lately, I don't know how familiar you guys are with that, but now there's a bunch of people who are sort of continuing the Kinch work by talking about validation. And I think something that might be happening with ironies is that irony introduces a problem in validating your interpretation of what you have read. So when the reader is trying to construct a situation model for the text, like what is it that this text is describing, what kind of event is it describing, there's a problem in validating the initial interpretation, which is supposedly the literal interpretation. And that's why we see only in the rereadings and not during the sort of progressive fixation. So the reader is reading through the sentence or the proposition relatively far enough, and then the reader notices, oh, it doesn't fit in there. There's a problem in validation, and that's seen then as a slowdown in the reading. So only the working memory capacity was related to the irony effects we saw, such that high working memory capacity was related to an earlier irony effect. The reason for this could be that high working memory capacity is needed in order to maintain the developing text representation so that you can notice that there's a coherence break. Or it could be related to the capacity that you need for maintaining the multiple interpretations. Or it could be related to the speed with which you can sort of retrieve an alternative meaning. Which one of these it is, that's hard to say. So the need for cognition or the self-reported use of sarcasm did not correlate with the irony effects. So obviously the individual differences there are in irony comprehension are not related to more general cognitive style of the person or self-reported use of sarcasm, but I am personally quite skeptical about how do you measure use of sarcasm. Actually, you would need to plug the person and record the conversations. You would need to record not only the conversations the person is having with the significant other, because it seems to be that the use of sarcasm depends on who you are talking with. You try to avoid sarcasm when you're talking to strangers because it often results in misunderstandings and stuff like that. So I don't know if it's even possible to measure the sarcasticity of the person reliably or not. But yeah.
How about openness to maintain multiple possibilities, and that would actually then show up as they get more exposed to irony, they would start to maintain more the figural sense. So what I'm saying is that could it be that you have different effects at the beginning of the experiment versus at the end?
Yes, certainly. And next I will show you how the effects actually change during the experiment. And it seems to be related to working memory capacity. So it suggests that it's about ability to maintain both the representation for the text that you're reading and the multiple meanings, and that you pick up on the pattern that you see. So now we saw that irony does slow down the reading. It does show up as slowed down in the sort of target sentences, but how do we know that this is specific to irony and not just to any type of weird language if we talk about figurative language? So we do know that irony requires, or we don't know, but it has been suggested that irony actually requires something these people call meta-representational reasoning. So the reader has to infer the emotional state of the speaker and connect that information with the interpretation of the utterance. Also the intention of the speaker, like why is this person doing this funny thing? The reader has to make that inference. For example, in metaphors, it's fairly simple. It's typically you can have metaphors that are type of A equals B, like marriage is like a roller coaster. So you just need to make the connection between roller coasters and marriages. And if you have enough knowledge of roller coasters, you can understand what is being meant by this metaphor. There have been done some brain imaging studies, and it seems to be that sarcasm activates different regions or networks in the brain than metaphors. And there's also some mainly patient studies that show that emotional processing is crucial for sarcasm comprehension. So in certain patient populations where emotional processing is, there's a problem in emotional processing, these people also seem to have problems in comprehending sarcasm. So what we did next was that we wanted to compare comprehension of sarcasm or irony to another type of figurative language, in this case metaphors, and then compare metaphors and sarcasm to literal utterances to see what is specific to processing of irony and what might be sort of common to all types of figurative language. And we were interested in the role of working memory capacity and emotional processing because these have been suggested as, well, working memory capacity in the previous studies and emotional processing in these studies as very important in comprehending irony. So this led to study 2. Here we had 60 participants. We measured working memory capacity as in the previous ones. And then Henry came up with this method called Iowa gambling task. Now, hands up, who knows what it is? So it's this card game. And so you have to sort of turn cards in the stacks of cards. You have 4 stacks of cards. You have to turn the card. And with a certain panel, you win or you lose. And there are certain stacks that result in bigger wins than others, and certain stacks that lead to bigger losses than others. And it's been shown that people who have certain type of brain damage, for example, they don't get that. They don't understand that certain stacks lead to losses and certain stacks lead to wins. And it's been thought that it's sort of tapping into your ability to combine emotions with decision making. And we thought that this would be some sort of a proxy of your ability to make use of emotional information when you're deciding on meanings or making decisions about the meaning of the information. We had 30 stories. We had literal, sarcastic, and metaphorical context in which, again, the same target sentence appeared, and then we tracked the eyes of the readers when they were reading these texts. And here's an example. Oh, my color codes are so slight, but hopefully you can see it. So the texts were constructed so that there's first an introduction. There were 3 different types of critical contexts. So the reader was always seeing only one person, one of these 3. So the literal critical context could be critical. While Paul is at stage, the audience is full of laughter. When Paul leaves the stage, he gets standing applause. Now, here's the target sentence. What a clown you are. Jack Harry shouts. And this translations of British names are very funny. of this sentence is literal. So the Jackery really means that Paul is a great clown. However, if this is what the reader has seen before, when Paul is on stage, the audience looks bored and some of them yawn. When Paul leaves the stage, he gets small applause. When Jack says, "What a clown you are," he's being sarcastic. It doesn't mean that he's a great clown. But you can also use this same sentence in a metaphorical meaning. For example, if somebody's acting as if he was a clown, but of course Jack does not mean that he really is a clown, but this is a metaphor for how funny somebody could be. So we compared the reading of these target sentences in these three different contexts. And here are the results. So again, we had phrase level measures, and we looked at different target regions. So we looked reading of the target sentence, the critical context, and then the spillover region, which is the next thing that came up in the text. And now I have tried to use different color codes for where we found the effect of the text type. So the purple ones are the measures we found the effect of the metaphorical text type. So this is where you see that reading time of the metaphorical sentences are longer than reading times of the sarcastic or the literal text or target sentences. This is the first pass reading time of the sentence. Same is true for the progressive fixation time, which is when the reader is progressing during the first pass reading. The reading times for the metaphorical sentences are longer than for sarcastic or literal. And also the probability of rereading is something where you see the effect of metaphors. So readers are more likely to reread the sentences if they are metaphorical utterances than if they are sarcastic or literal. So it seems to be that metaphors are resolved already during the first pass reading. In this study, when we look at the reading of the ironies, we get effects in the look-back fixation times, probability of looking back, and then we had a measure which is look-from fixation time. So it's the time that the readers spend after going away from the target sentence. So it's the measure of how much readers return backwards in the text. So here you see that look-back fixation times are longer in sarcastic text than in metaphorical or in literal text. The probability of looking back, that must be the error there. No, here we go. This is the mean and not this one. Sorry. So here the probability of looking back is higher in sarcastic than other types of text. And also the look-from fixation times are longer for the sarcastic than metaphorical or literal text. So it seems to be that there is a difference in how readers resolve metaphors and sarcasm or ironies, and the difference is in the time. So the metaphors are resolved more or less during the first pass reading on the spot. Sarcasm mainly induces this sort of later processing, extra processing, as I would like to think reinterpretation type of processing. Now how about the individual differences measures? We only found individual differences in the processing of sarcasm, but not in the processing of metaphors. Working memory capacity was again related or correlated with processing of sarcasm, so that if you look at the first pass rereadings, figures are quite terrible. My apologies for the long error bars here, but these are observed means and observed standard deviations, or the standard deviations for the observed means. So what you see is that in the high working memory capacity group, readers do more rereading when it's sarcastic than literal target sentence. For low working memory capacity group, you don't see any effect. Same is, but then the picture changes when you look at the lookbacks to target sentences. Here you see that now it's the low working memory capacity readers who look back to the target sentence. High span readers don't need to do it anymore because they did it already during the first pass reading. So again, what you see is that working memory capacity seems to be related to the time course of resolving the sarcasm, so that high working memory capacity readers are faster, they show it earlier, and the low working memory capacity readers.
Are those texts reliable then, Johanna?
Yes, they are. I wouldn't be showing them.
We might be trying to flag it.
Then this card game measure, the Iowa gambling task, which is supposed to be tapping something related to how you use emotions when you're making decisions. Now, here what you could look at, for example, is to compare the low IGT readers and high IGT readers. In reading of sarcasm, you see that there's no difference there. If you look at processing of sarcasm, you see that these IGT readers who have low scores in this card game, they seem to be doing more looking back to the target sentence than the ones who have high IGT. And a similar thing happens if you look at the loop from the target sentence. Again, low IGT seems to be related to sort of longer looking from the target sentence, which means returning back in the text when you're reading a sarcastic than a literal text. And then if you look at lookbacks to the critical context, you see that if you compare sort of the literal, well, this is not huge, but there's an interaction, so that's why there's a bigger. So what these results seem to be suggesting is that this card game thing, this Iowa gambling task, is related again to the time course of processing sarcasm, but mainly to later looking back kind of behavior. So that it seems to be that readers who have low IGT need to do more rereading in order to resolve the sarcastic meaning there. And now rereading meaning is look back reading, which is sort of not during the first pass reading of the sentence, but like later rechecking information in the text. So what these results show us is that metaphors are resolved relatively immediately. The effect is observed already in the first pass reading measures, and sarcasm is resolved later. So the effect is in the lookbacks. An interesting notion that I don't know, maybe you spied on me when I was preparing this talk,
No.
was that in study 2, when we were running the LMEs, I suggested to him that why don't you put in the trial number as a predictor. And something that you actually see there is that, of course, reading gets faster during the course of the experiment. This is something we all know, that readers, when they are in the experiment, either they want to get out faster or the reading just gets sort of easier towards the end of the experiment. But something that also happens was that some of the effects changed during the course of the experiment. So we had an effect in the spillover region. So it's the region after the target sentence in the beginning of the experimental session for the sarcastic sentences. But this effect diminishes towards the end of the session. So when you look at the average across the whole experiment, you don't get the effect in the spillover region. So you get the effect only in the beginning of the experiment, and then it washes out towards the end. These kind of things, I can, if you're really, really interested, I can send you the paper so that you can see all these sort of trial effects we had. But there seems to be something going on there, and it's related to the ease with which. So I think the task a little bit changes during the course of the experiment. So in the beginning, you get these funny situations where somebody's saying something strange. But as the experiment proceeds, you learn kind of, okay, sometimes there are these funny sentences and they are either ironic, metaphorical, or there's nothing funny about it. And it changes slightly the effects. It does not change the effects that I showed you earlier. These are the reliable effects across the experiment. But there was something else happening in the other measures, but these were modulated by the trial number. Yeah.
So is that related to focus on the gambling task?
Now, I can't remember if they were related to that. I think there were effects that were related to working memory capacity, but I can check who the exact ones. this was just an interesting notion, I thought. This is something we have traditionally just ignored as random variables in our data, but now we do have tools for looking into stuff like this, and well, maybe it doesn't matter, but sometimes I think it might. What our results tell us is that comprehension of sarcasm is not completely, but it is a different process than comprehension of metaphor. Just like these other guys have already suggested, the cognitive demands are very different. So when you're comprehending a metaphor, you need to just make a connection between what is being said in the text and what you know about this thing previously. So metaphors are, if they are type A equals B, like marriages are roller coasters. As long as you do have experience about roller coasters and you know what a marriage is, you can make the connection and understand what this metaphor means. Whereas when you're comprehending sarcasm, you need to figure out why is that person saying that thing. So you need to make an inference about the emotional state of the speaker and possibly the intentions of the speaker. We only observe individual differences in the processing of sarcasm. In some prior studies, working memory capacity has been also found to correlate with comprehension of metaphors, but their tasks were a little bit different. Working memory capacity, we can think of it as a general cognitive constraint. And also in the study one, we already found that it's related to earlier resolution of the sarcastic meaning. Now, the Iowa gambling task, the low Iowa gambling task measures were related to more effortful resolution of sarcasm, and more effortful here meaning these readers had to do later, looking back to the text more in order to understand what was being said. So what these results suggest is that theoretical models should incorporate individual differences that are related to either general cognitive constraints and emotional processing ability in order to fully explain what's happening when people are comprehending figurative language and sarcasm. Now, unfortunately, there's only one theory that can do this, and it's this parallel constraint satisfaction model. I copy and pasted it from a paper by Pexman. So the idea there is that when you see or hear a comment like fantastic, we'll get to spend more time on this plane. I think the context was that you're stuck in a plane and then you get the announcement that we're sorry, it's going to take another 2 hours before we get to all kind of situation where you guys were. So this kind of statement or thing that you hear or read, it activates all kind of cues. Cues related to the events, cues related to the statement, and cues related to the speaker. And you use these cues in order to activate potential meanings in these sort of, Pexman calls it the interpretation space. And whatever sort of gets most activated in the interpretation space is then taken as the meaning of these features. Now, because these parallel constraint satisfaction models are so flexible, you can always introduce constraints that are constraining what kind of information, either the cues the reader is using or what can be activated in the interpretation space. But this is, of course, something that I hope Henry will think about and come up with the perfect theory for this sarcasm constraints. Okay, what are we going to do in the future? In addition to making pizza in my fabulous pizza oven, what Henry is doing at the moment is running an experiment on how readers make use of contextual cues when they are reading sarcasm. So he's manipulating the amount of context that the reader has when they encounter a sarcastic comment in the text. He's also comparing sarcasm to lies. So that's also an interesting thing. If the sort of the crucial thing in comprehending sarcasm is that you have to understand the intention of the speaker. The same is true for lies. You do have to understand the intention of the speaker in order to understand that somebody's lying and not speaking, meaning exactly what they are saying. So that kind of stuff we have going on. And that's all I have to say. Thank you. Questions? Simon?
Okay, so I mean, so if you go back about 3 slides. No, forward. Okay, so I mean, at some level, I understand that clearly comprehension of sarcasm is different to comprehension of metaphor, right? I understand that, right? And I can see from the data that there's clearly a different time course to the processing that's going on there. But at a fundamental level, right, what you've got to do in both these scenarios is maintain almost 2 interpretations of the situation. Do you understand what I mean? You've got to kind of engage with a non-literal interpretation as well as a literal one that admittedly doesn't make sense in some context with the A equals B. So, whilst I accept what's on the discussion slide there, it does seem to me that it's a fair question to put you as to, so why is it?
Different or
Yeah.
why is it different?
So, if you accept that, it's about engaging with 2 representations of meaning simultaneously, then clearly it's possible to do that from the metaphor data online. But we're not doing it when we deal with sarcasm. So why do we do it in one situation but not another? I mean, you could imagine if the system was running at maximum efficiency, it would just say, okay, I can deal with any of these situations, like lying or, why would we have a different time course?
Yeah, well, we think if you look at the individual differences data that we get, is that it seems to be that different types of individual differences sort of come out when you're comprehending metaphors and when you're comprehending ironies or sarcasm, and those I think give you cues about why they are so different. It's obviously something emotional is going on when you're reading sarcasm. You need to understand like what's the mindset of this speaker. Whereas in metaphors it doesn't matter. It doesn't have the emotional component. Whatever. You just need to make simple connection with your prior knowledge. The other thing is sarcasm might also require that you have to understand the intentions of the speaker. So it's a much more complicated process, and it's kind of having these social, emotional aspects to it. Whereas comprehension of metaphor is fairly simple.
Well, I mean, when you look at your total times, for the whole passage, say, are they just longer for the sarcasm overall, right? So that would, if what you've said is true, then we should find a much longer time for sarcasm relative to metaphor. But it seemed to me, just looking at your numbers,
Yeah, it's just the time.
that's right. It's just a balance thing, right?
But couldn't it still be that the cognitive demands are different?
Yeah, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that if that's the case, then it seems to me that the onus on people working in this area, you and others, not just you, is to try and explain. I mean, what must be going on is that the discourse representation must be formed to a differing degree under those 2 circumstances. And then the issue is, well, how can someone spot that something's sarcastic or not so early, or how can someone spot early that something's a metaphor? Do you know what I mean? I'd have to look at your stimuli again to really see this, how this might develop in a different time course.
So now if we think about the discourse comprehension models, like a Kinch's comprehension model, there's something which is, so he says certain types of processes happen automatically, and one thing that happens automatically is the activation of background knowledge. Inferencing might take longer time. We know that people routinely make only certain types of inferences, which are backward, sort of inferences that are absolutely necessary for you to understand, like pronominal reference type of inferencing. But other types of inferences, we don't know if people even do those routinely, unless there's a certain sort of reason for them to engage in more effortful inference processing. And I think it could be just that metaphor, it only requires you to activate the background knowledge, which we already know is kind of automatic in a sense. But inferring the meaning for the sarcastic utterance is takes a
be true. I think another fundamental difference to my mind is that for the metaphors there is no literal meaning you can form, right? With the others there is. So you can almost engage with it, there's no violation, right? And then you go, oh, okay, right, and then you go, hang on a minute, something's not quite right here. Whereas when you get, marriages or whatever it was, the roller coaster, it's like this is, at that point, unless you take an anomalous view of it, you're basically forced to do it online, right?
That's a good point. Any thoughts?
Cheeky question. Do you have any, I've never heard about the IGT before, do you have any a priori predictions of this?
Yeah, so these measures, I know it sounds like we just came up with measures, but actually what Henry did was a huge lit review of things like individual differences in comprehension of figurative language. And these are measures that mostly, because most of the individual differences work that has been done with patient populations. And what he learned from that is that it seems to be that certain types of problems seem to be related to problems in comprehending of sarcasm. And then, a lot of the measures are something that are only good in distinguishing between individuals who have either a frontal lobe problem or no problem at all. So then we picked from those the measures that we thought could be sensitive enough even in a normal population. And clearly something that has been implied is emotional processing. And actually at some point Henry got super excited about this Damasio's, what is it called, the marker hypothesis. So there's like an area here which is very important when you're connecting emotions with your decision making, and he thinks that it could be something related to that, why sarcasm is difficult for certain people.
But maybe I just don't understand it. How is that test supposed to measure emotional processing?
So it's, well, good question. We do know that people with certain type of brain damage show different performance in the task. And so there is this sort of whole reward and punishment thing going on when you're doing your winning and losing when you pick one certain
Maybe they're not just learning, do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Which could then be related to working memory anyway.
Yes.
But I just cannot see why
Yeah.
it's kind of emotional.
Yeah. It
It
is, but I have to say that the correlations between our predictors were relatively low, so it's not like they weren't measuring the same thing. So if the correlation was like 0.30, so there is a correlation, but it's not that huge.
So what about humour then? I mean, it seems to me that although you're saying that sarcasm's a negative thing, I wouldn't always say it was.
It's funny.
I would say sometimes people try to use it to create a humorous situation or
Yes,
diffuse some
absolutely.
sense of difficulty or whatever it is. So I mean, it feels to me that I wonder whether you could, in the same way as Henry's going on to look at lying, I wonder if you could, you could think of written scenarios where there's clearly something extremely funny. I mean, there are many written situations where people laugh out loud.
Yeah, I tried to make him try jokes next, but he wanted to go with lies.
Yeah.
But it is true that, so something that is also, we do know that the reason why people use sarcasm is oftentimes that they want to be funny. It is also the reason why men are often more sarcastic. If you start doing research on when people use sarcasm, men seem to be more sarcastic than women, and one explanation that has been given to it is that the gender difference is related to men willing to be funnier than ladies. Women don't want to be funny. I don't know. Also, there's a lot of research, or not a lot of, but recently there was a whole study published in US about the states that are sarcastic and the states that are not, and that just seems to coincide with the Democratic Republican. The
Democratic blue and red
Oh,
states.
okay.
About 90% of the US can be explained by that as well.
Yeah. So yeah, But I think written sarcasm is super interesting because there you have ripped all the extra cues speakers can use to imply that I'm being sarcastic, and that's why I thought it was so interesting that there are no extra cues like the tone of voice or facial expression or gestures or anything. You really need to construct a meaning when you.
It reminds me of the stuff, you know, years ago Sanford and Garrett used to do when, you know, they would say something like, it's hot in here, and what they would be actually saying is, please go and open the window. Do you know what I mean? But you've got to go way beyond the literal
Yeah.
to get to the meaning of what's intended.